Welcome to Call of Your Soul.
Welcome to episode 3. This is Dan Ellis with Call of Your Soul. And before we begin today's episode, just taking a moment to get settled and centered in preparation to receive. If you're in a place to do so, I invite you to close your eyes and just become still with the body. Notice sensations coming through your body, thoughts in the mind. And then finish the next exhale that you're on, and then pull all the air out of the body. Inviting a deeper breath in. Hold. And release out. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the 8 limbs of yoga. And this is a practice and a tradition that is pretty seminal in terms of the practice and the understanding and the philosophy of yoga. One distinction I'd like to make is the text that I'm referencing here in this content comes from the Yoga Sutras. Now, there is some parallel between yoga and the Vedic traditions in Hinduism in India. However, yoga really does stand alone as a practice and a philosophy. So this isn't something that is born of and is married to a Vedic tradition or Hinduism. One of the common parallels is that the original Yoga Sutras and a lot of the ancient yogic texts are written in Sanskrit originally. That is also true of a lot of the traditions, Vedic traditions and traditions in Hinduism, also written in that language. But it really is a practice and a philosophy that really stands alone, separate from religion. So in that way, it is meant to be more a practical teaching and something that can be universally practiced regardless of a religious affiliation. So as stated, the bulk of the information from today's podcast was taken from 2 books. The first of which is the Yoga Sutras, which is written by Patanjali. And the second is the Yamas and Niyamas, which was written by Deborah Adele. So the Yoga Sutras were written by Patanjali, and it's interesting because I find sort of a similar parallel between Patanjali and Shakespeare. If you go back into the history, and granted, this book was originally written in the 4th century BCE, and so when you go that far back, it's very difficult to tie this teaching to a single person, to a single man. And it was likely that this is a text and a teaching that has evolved over time. And while there is probably one central figure, that originally put it to paper and transcribed the outline of the teaching, it's probably our best understanding is that it's evolved over time. With more people studying and then putting their twist and their take on the version that we now have today, in the similar way that we've seen with the Bible and other sacred texts. So the 8 limbs of yoga is called Ashtanga yoga. And so there's a specific asana practice, a physical practice called Ashtanga yoga, but this is more of a comprehensive understanding of Ashtanga yoga. So the Ashtanga name comes from 2 stem words. The first is Ashta, which means 8, and Anga, which means limb. So quite literally, 8-limbed yoga. So the a sutra literally translates to a thread, right? So it is this basically threads of information, insights, and wisdom that's woven together in a coherent message. So the Yoga Sutras is composed of about 200 verses or 200 sutras that averages about 6 words each, which is interesting when you think about the composition of this from a literary standpoint. 6 words in a thread is more akin to a poem than it is like a broad seminal text. So it's very, very condensed. And the way that the sutra is presented, it gives you within the first 4 opening lines or the first 4 sutras, it basically gives you the entire essence of the teaching. And then the rest of the book then elaborates and helps explain and bring clarity and additional illustration to understand the deeper parts of this message, but then further how to practically apply it and how to actually go about achieving this basically goal that it's setting out to be. So what is this goal? What is the seed, right, of the teaching of the Yoga Sutras? So it basically comes into 3 parts. And there's a man named Panini, who was a grammarian who codified Sanskrit in the 4th century BCE. And he defines yoga as of 3 parts. The first is union. The second is coherence. And the third is the settling of the individual mind into its simplest and most expanded form of awareness. So to give some, because that comes at a sort of an abstract and theoretical level, so to put these 3 kind of pillars, if you will, into a more digestible form, union. So what do we mean by union? The example that I like to use is look at what you see in that evolves in a sports team over the course of a season. You have individual players with individual skill sets and personalities. And so the goal of a coach is to bring all of these individual players and skill sets into their best position and get them to work and function as a team. So whereas you first have, let's say, for example, basketball, you have five players that end up working together and working as one single unit. That, to me, is a really simple and very tangible example, especially in the U.S. with sports, of this idea of union. But the sutras are really talking more about an inward process, this happening within ourselves. So whereas we could take this as the players in the team is the metaphor of the different aspects and the different layers, the different fabric of our being. And one way you could look at that as the physical level of the body, the emotional body, the mental body, and then our spiritual selves, our soul, if you will. The next pillar is coherence. So what do we mean by coherence? And the best way that I've thought of to describe this is using the example of music, right? So when people are playing music, now there's some exception to this in, very experimental jazz, but most often when you have different instruments playing, there's what's called a key signature. So all of the notes that are being played by all the different instruments are within this key signature, right? So there's a set of notes for each what you call root note, right? So in this key, there's a certain set of notes that are going to be in harmony with the rest of the notes being played. And so coherence is for a group of musicians to play within a key signature. So there's a harmony, there's a resonance, and there's not 2 sounds that are competing and cause a sense of friction within the music that's being played. So likewise within our own selves, and this shows up typically, really it shows up in all phases, right? So a lack of coherence in the physical body can be knots, can be tension, can be a variety of different issues, tumors, and then in the emotional level, this is an emotional disharmony, right? Where we have very intense emotions that can then precipitate physical illness. And then, of course, on the mental level, where we have blockages in our mentation, where we feel cloudy, where we feel foggy, or where we have these irreconcilable ideas that we can no longer marry. Like there's a dissonance between what we think and what we see in our experience. And it's for that reason that I think the process of being a mystic in the world. And so, there's a lot of connotations with that. And what I mean by being a mystic is someone who learns as a result of direct experience. And then the direct experience can then lead us on how it is that we need to shape our mental apparatus, our belief systems, the way that we interact and perceive our reality with the world so that we can be within greater harmony of that. So that's coherence. Last pillar is the settling of the individual mind into silence, into its simplest and most expanded form of awareness. And we'll address this a little bit later. So I just want to go ahead and set that seed. Now, the 8 limbs of yoga. So the first 2 are what we call the yamas and the niyamas. These are packaged together, and this is the first book, the information that comes from this first book by Deborah Adele. The yamas and niyamas you could look at as sort of a parallel to the 10 Commandments. It's a little bit different, but it basically comprises ethical tenets, right? So considerations for how not only we behave in relationship to others, which is the yamas, but also the behavior in which we are in relationship to ourselves. So first, starting off with the yamas and the niyamas. Actually, there's one thing I want to mention first. In the Yoga Sutras, I found this interesting. So there's yugas in Vedic teaching and yoga teaching. Yugas are basically ages, right? And so they're basically cycles at which the universe goes through. And there's 4 primary yugas, and there was a gentleman that was talking about the Kali Yuga, which is considered the Dark Age. So it's a time of spiritual aridity that has a certain set of qualities. And it can be a little bit morbid to look at it this way, but it's also sort of a realism check about the state of where things are. And not saying that we're necessarily in the Kali Yuga. Some may subscribe to that idea, but I find it interesting as I read this, and I'd like to share this about what this individual named Vishnu Purana was writing about Kali Yuga and what I found to be true in certain aspects about modern day. So he describes Kali Yuga as a society reaches a stage where property confers rank, wealth becomes the only source of virtue, passion the sole bond of union between husband and wife, falsehood the source of succession life, sex the only means of enjoyment, and outer trappings are mistaken for inner religion. So there's definitely some pieces of those where I found, especially in the West, with a very highly capitalistic society, which has its merits and ways that it's very intelligently distributes resources. I think you could say that there's definitely some evidence of where we have our property and what we own confers a sort of rank in the social hierarchy. Same thing as, the phrase came to mind with wealth becomes the only source of virtue, the almighty dollar, right? Passion, the sole bond of union between husband and wife, right? And so I think one thing that people look for in their relationships nowadays is someone who can be a best friend, not just someone that you share, sexuality and intimacy with. Sex is the only means of enjoyment, and outer trappings mistaken for inner religion, right? And so this is kind of pointing us back inwards, and which is why I like the Yoga Sutras and yoga as a practice and philosophy, because I think the greatest truth that we will find is that comes from within, because there's always universal truths and relative truths. And so ultimately looking for what is going to help us find the calling for our own lives and help us find truth in the world, we have to look within, because it is the relationship of us to the world and the people in it that is going to show us what it is that we need to grow, learn, or change in order to get there. All right, so now to the yamas. The first of which is called ahimsa. Ahimsa. Ahimsa translates to nonviolence. In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, he mentions that the ahimsa interpretation is to live in the absence of fear. Nonviolence and living in the absence of fear. So, of course, when we think of violence, we think of this on a gross level. So, as in killing and as in causing physical harm. So, this is quite obvious, and that's a pretty easy and applicable tenet to implement. But there's also violence on much subtler levels. So, think about the concepts or the prospect of rushing, worrying, being harsh with words, threatening, or even just malevolent thinking of your own self, being very inner critical. So if you think about it, in the same way that physical violence can harm the physical body, rushing, worrying, being threatening, or being very critical upon yourself can have the same type of violent impact to the nervous system and to emotions that physical contact and physical aggression can have on the physical body. And it's interesting because this tenet is also reflected in the Hippocratic oath that doctors take. And this comes back all the way to the 5th century BC. First, do no harm. First, do no harm. And I think there's a little bit of work to be done with this, particularly in the medical field, where we really want to find, or in health in general, we want to find a solution first. But there's quite a lot of deaths being caused by iatrogenic illness, which is basically death by medication. Those estimates range between 100 to 300,000 deaths a year. That's quite a lot of death being caused by trying to help and trying to heal. So the key question is, what is the source of the fear? So we have some fears that are instinctual for survival, and then we have some that are of the social level. And it's interesting because, what is the common notion that you hear about, what is someone's greatest fear? It's the fear of being embarrassed and humiliated in front of other people, right? People often say public speaking. So it's interesting that that is a very common source of fear instead of, this more instinctual fear for survival. So it's interesting to look at fear and nonviolence, this concepts of ahimsa, really more on the subtle level than on the gross level. I like this quote that I found from a Steve Jobs interview. He said, "If you're afraid of failing, you won't get very far." And this came from when he was about 12 years old, wanting to build frequency counters, and actually called Bill Hewlett up and said, "I want to build these. Do you have some spare parts for me to just get started and try it on my own?" Lo and behold, found his first job building frequency counters, and then lo and behold, what it led to. But if you're afraid of failing and unwilling to ask, unwilling to act, then it's never going to happen. And I find 3 individuals that elucidate this tenet very well as Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and MLK, using nonviolence as the principles for which they wanted to precipitate change. And in my opinion, that's really how we get lasting change. It's not really because violence begets violence, war begets war, and the way, in my opinion, that we evolve past that is to come beyond the use of violence to impose our will, and coming from a place of nonviolence and understanding. All right, yama number 2, satya. Satya. Satya means truthfulness. It's very interesting. There was this individual named Yogaraj Achala, and so he has this quote of "Watch out for nice people." What I think he's speaking to is this cultural dynamic of being nice at the expense of being truthful, right? Because if you're always nice, then that means at some point you're going to have to lie in order to stay nice. Right? If you're always nice, you're going to have to distort reality. You're going to have to give selective information, or just straight up not tell the truth in order to keep things on an even keel, in order to remain nice. A great example is, let's say someone's worked on a project and it's really not good work. It sucks. And they ask you for honest feedback. What do you say? Right? So a lot of times, we can sugarcoat, we can kind of put some window dressing around the truth. But oftentimes it's probably better just to tell them, hey, I really don't think this is good, or I think this is the problem. But a lot of times we're unsure, or we're afraid of emotional dissonance coming, right? We're afraid of hurting someone's feelings. So then we sacrifice the truth in order to not push a button and create a problem. Another example is, let's say it's someone that we don't particularly like, and they ask to spend time with us. Do we lie and make up an excuse? Or do we just go ahead and address the fact that, I'm just, I'm not interested at this point, and find a way to be direct but honest in a compassionate way. And then we don't have to continue making excuses. They know where they stand. They know where we stand, and the expectations are set. So then we can all move forward knowing where each other is at. And so I find when we're real and honest, there's really nothing to defend. There's nothing to hide, and there's nothing to remember. Life is a lot simpler this way. And that's one way we can avoid the emotional and the psychological burden of this kind of hide and seek game with the truth. The truth is often not easy. Carl Jung has a quote that says, "A lie would make no sense unless the truth was felt to be dangerous." I also found this interesting. This was in the book. Arthur Samuel Joseph was a teacher, and he had this exercise where he would have the students read a poem or sing a song, and then he'd have them repeat the exact same exercise, but then the second time he would have them do it naked. And he said it was almost always very distinguishable of which one was done naked or not. And he said that there was always a vibrance to when the poem was read or the song was sung naked. And so it's a great exercise in thinking about what's the most honest, truthful way to be in the world, and to come from that place. But it's interesting because it's talking about the relationship between satya and ahimsa. And when we are having a difficulty with the concept of satya, ahimsa always trumps. So when we have a conflict between nonviolence and truthfulness, we'll choose nonviolence first. Third yama is called asteya. Asteya. Asteya means non-stealing. So the absence of laying claim to what is not ours. And so there's a word that came to my mind when I was writing the second sentence. And I almost said the absence of laying claim to what is not rightfully ours. But I left out the term rightfully because rightfully has a sense of interpretation of what should be ours. And so I leave this part out because that's really not the essence of what Asteya is saying here. It's reflecting the principle of only what is ours that really is. And it reflects this principle in relationship to each other of reciprocity, of this back and forth, right? And so it's not this this sense of taking and holding, right? Because that's how the world works, right? If the water cycle was not in accordance with Asteya, then we would never have rain, and we run out of water pretty quickly. And so it's being in accordance of the exchange of our time and our energy and our money and our property, such that reflects this cyclical nature of the universe. And so, of course, we can think about stealing on the simple level of taking things from a business or another person. But there's also, like with ahimsa, more subtle aspects to it where we steal opportunity from ourselves. We steal from opportunities from others. We steal from the earth. we steal from the earth in quite abundance, right? In pursuit of all of the material desires and goals and all the things that we want to make and build. And there's slowly becoming more consciousness with this, with the environmental and social impacts, and thinking about the life cycle of products, and being more responsible with what we're taking from the earth and what we're creating, especially when it comes to toxic materials and things like plastics that don't break down. But then we also have to think about the effects that we're making, especially on a collective scale, about stealing from future generations, right? Where, we may be leaving quite a mess for future generations of creating these materials that don't break down. And so some questions to ask and sit with the concept of astia and non-stealing is, why am I not receiving? What limiting beliefs do we have that are blocking the flow of what it is that we're ready to receive? What competencies, skills, or foundation needs to be established to be able to receive what you need? And then in what ways may we not be giving and not reciprocating the cycle and the flow and exchange of our time and resources and materials? The next yama is called brahmacharya. Brahmacharya. Brahmacharya means non-excess. And so, of course, I could go on a tangent about, the materialism of the Western world, and especially about the United States and how much, wealth and production and, basically resources per capita that the U.S. has relative to other countries. But I found a more suitable direction in explaining this yama, because it literally translates to walking with God. And so I thought, well, that's a much better place to put our intention. So the practice of brahmacharya encourages us to remember that everything is made of and made by the hand of God. Everything is sacred. There's nothing that's not sacred. And so this is, brahmacharya is often associated with abstinence or celibacy, which is a form of, fasting, which is in, traditionally for ascetics and monks, that's a practice to exercise, reverence and caution with respect to, temptations and desires in the world. And that definitely has its place. But I find it especially for householders, and explaining this concept and making it digestible for the Western world, the practice is to become intentional with everything that one chooses to act upon, and acknowledging the consequences of each decision, and seeing everything in the world as sacred, because everything is made by the divine hand, including us and everything that we act upon and with in our world. And I find this is funny because it's a bit different notion than everything in moderation, right? Would you tell your child, take heroin, but just in moderation? Of course not, right? And so it's not, I find it helpful not to look at this in the lens of, non-excess, scarcity, and abundance, but looking at it as becoming very intentional and seeing the sacredness by which we choose to act. And in that vein, it's much easier to discern what is right. So some of the questions to consider with brahmacharya is, what is our relationship to the thing that we potentially may be having struggle with? And whether that's enmeshment in a relationship with another person, whether that's food, whether that's a chemical, something that we ingest, like coffee. And what is the driving force behind our decision to accumulate, give away, or hoard? I found this interesting because with non-excess, there's an abundance of examples that we could look at, but there's quite a culture now in the U.S. with the advent of smartphones of an excess of stimulation. And so we have, I believe anyone on an iPhone has a weekly report that shows of how many hours and minutes per day you spend on your phone. And so just in your mind, just take a guess at what you think the average American spends per day on their smartphone. The answer is 5.4 hours per day, which may not sound like too much, but you have to think about it. Most people also are working on a laptop. So when you add the two of them together, it's probably over 10 hours a day, which is quite a lot of information, and which I think is going to very intensely shape our mental makeup. And I think we're seeing quite a lot of social change very rapidly that it's going to take us a few decades to figure out. So brahmacharya, interesting concept, especially in modern day with the excesses that we have access to. And I would put a special asterisk next to the excess amount of information to be processed, decisions to be made, and the amount of stimulation and intake that we have in. And the last of the yamas is called aparigraha. Aparigraha. Aparigraha means non-possessiveness. This one is very interesting because I find it most tying to our relationships. Because, like I said earlier, people's biggest fear is that of humiliation and embarrassment in public, right? And that most commonly is associated with the act of public speaking. And so when we cling and grasp and hold on, we're usually doing so out of either a desire for indulgence or for a fear of lack of. And so this grasping and this holding is sort of the image of a parigraha. And when we grasp and hold on to something, we're immediately not in harmony with the way that the universe works in things being cyclical and reciprocal, right? A back and forth flow and exchange. We're disrupting that process. So then inevitably we're going to create suffering. And it's not, of course, just people that we can have malevolent relationships with in with respect to a parigraha. Of course, that can be possessions. It can be positions socially or within a company. It can be ideals. It can be philosophies, right? There's quite a lot that we can cling to and identify with that have its place, but depending on our relationship to it, can beget conflict with each other, an unnecessary amount of, and suffering. I found an interesting example for a parigraha in modern day America, because there's been this sort of phenomenon in my lifetime of storage space, right? It's these air-conditioned spaces that we keep stuff and stuff that we really don't use, right? That's why it's not even at our homes. So we have our homes, which are, on average pretty large relative to the rest of the world, and we have garages, but we also have storage units, which are not even at our homes to hold on this stuff that we aren't using. And so in the United States right now, there's over 2 billion square feet of storage space. So to put that in context and to make it tangible, that is enough storage space roof for every single American to stand under. So it's about 7 square feet per person. That's quite a lot of space for stuff that we're perhaps clinging and holding on to that maybe would be best served to be given somewhere else. A quote that I remember from the movie Fight Club that I really enjoyed and have reflected on ever since I heard it. It comes from the character Tyler Durden, and what he says in a very quick, succinct way, and this is the character played by Brad Pitt for context: the things you own end up owning you. The things you owned end up owning you. And I find that really to be true, because when we have things, everything has an energy to it, an energy signature to it. And even if that's a tough idea to subscribe to, then you could at least subscribe to the idea that everything that we have has to have energy put into it to be kept and to be maintained, right? So we have to have a storage unit to put it, or it needs maintenance, right? So if it's a machine or it's a piece of wood that needs oil, everything needs a sort of maintenance and care. So the more things that we have, especially that we don't need, that's continuing to suck our energy. And even if it's just mental, where every now and then we have to think about it. So that's where I think this idea of minimalism was birthed from. And it's sort of this kind of opposite end of the pendulum to counterbalance this level of excess that we've now, and this lack of willingness to adhere to aparigraha in non-possessiveness, where we're clinging to things. And so some questions to reflect on too for aparigraha are, what do you cling to? And an interesting exercise I've seen them do with like celebrities on YouTube is make a list of the top 5 things that you can't do without. So I invite each of us to do that. Make a list of 5 things, first 5 things that come to your mind that you couldn't do without. And then over the next week or two, really investigate your relationship with these items, not necessarily the items themselves and the functions that they play in your life, but what is your relationship to that item? And is there a sense of possessiveness, a clinging, a grasping that's unhealthy in relationship to this item? And then sit with it. Now, switching to the niyamas. So these are the ethical tenets related to the relationship with oneself. The first one is called saucha. Saucha means purity. And what saucha is inviting us to is a purification of body, thought, and speech. And in this process of purification, it brings out a brightness and a clarity to our essence, right? Because we're moving the fog, we're moving the mud from in front of our view, and removing the funk from our life so that we can be in our most purest and vibrant form. So it's like you have a lampshade, right? And there's been a lot of like dust and dirt and gunk that's gotten in the lampshade, and so you really aren't able to see the brightness and the essence of the bulb. And it's not necessarily that the bulb isn't shining, but it's that we have all this dirt, and we have this impurity that's preventing the bulb from being able to glow in its radiant essence. And so that is basically what saucha is inviting us to, is this process of removing that which blocks the light from being able to shine in its greatest essence. And so to think about that, so of course we have purification of body, right? And that's pretty tangible. Now there's a host of belief systems about how to do that, and a minor obsession in our culture with dieting and the type of dieting that's right for everyone's body. But I would say that I would argue that this is probably a greater point. Purity in our relationships with each other. Right? And so what are some of these impurities that taint and make our relationships with each other more difficult? Judgment, criticism, control, manipulation, pretense, disappointment, or avoidance. So that's quite a lot there to unpack and sit with. One sort of allegory that was mentioned in the book that I found to be a really great short synopsis of kind of making this point crystal. There was a young boy that was looking at a river with an elder, and he was a yogi, and so he asked, why is the river so dirty? And so the yogi turns out to him and he said, the river's not dirty. The river is pure, but it's carrying away the impurities, right? So it's not that the river, and this is a metaphor for us. It's not that the river or us is impure by nature. We were born pure into these bodies as babies. It's that all this stuff, all of this, toxicity, all these concepts like judgment, criticism, control, all the toxins that we've ingested physically are now flowing through the rivers of our bodies. And so saucha is the process inviting us to purify that. And yoga has quite a lot of ways of doing so. Some are a bit extreme, especially relative to our culture, but very interesting processes and exercises that we can do for cleansing. Some we'll talk about here in the second phase of the 8 limbs of yoga. And one of the practices I find interesting that is not very common in the Western world is a fasting practice. So, of course, fasting we associate with the absence of food, which is not totally uncommon, but fasting of words is much less common. Very rarely will you have someone in the Western world where they're not speaking to you because they're on a fast. Basically, they're purifying thought and speech. And I think that could go a long way, especially for for some of us that have bad habits with how we use our thought and speech. And so, one thing I wanted to bring attention to as sort of a goal for the concept of saucha is, we can all recall moments in life where the life force, the prana, the chi pulses through us like an electricity, and we feel vibrant and we feel youthful, and the words just flow off our tongue. Our bodies are just gracefully moving through the air, and the obstacles to our path just dissolve seemingly instantaneously. And so this is what saucha is inviting us to, right? Is to come back to that highest and purest emanation of our being and maintain it and operate from there. Santosha. Next niyama is called Santosha. I love this niyama especially because there is a wonderful place in Sandy Springs that's called Santosha, that's operated by a friend of mine, where a lot of yoga and yoga type work and energy work happens. And what Santosha is inviting us to is to embody a sense of contentment with the way in which we are in relationship with the world. And where I found it easiest to explain this is sort of describing the opposite first. So the opposite is riding the waves of desires, right? We're on the surface of the ocean and we just have desire after desire, and we're just following what we want. Our wants are governing everything, or we're just bobbing up and down, getting tossed and turned by the waves. Santosha, on the contrary, is going beneath the waves and being absorbed in this current of gratification, of gratitude, which happens underneath the waves. It's not bobbing and weaving so heavily with our wants and our desires and our wishes, but it's floating in that current that's underneath with just joy and gratitude for everything that we have. And so Santosha provides an invitation to a calm center with an open heart filled with gratitude. And in this state, we don't feel lack. We don't really feel impoverished. But it has to be a sincere gratitude. The practice of a gratitude journal can be a wonderful practice and help direct our awareness back to what we have and to be grateful for it. And so one of the things mentioned in the book that I like was that we wish to be strong of will, but gentle of heart. Strong of will, but gentle of heart. And so I think one of the pitfalls with Santosha is the relationship that we have to our goals. In the Western world, we're very goal-oriented. We are very motivated by our desire to want to create our visions, which is a beautiful exercise and a beautiful tenet and a beautiful gift of being human. And that's a bit of what separates us from other species of animals, is we have more ability to take our will and our vision and actually enact it and build it into the world. But again, the key issue is, what is your relationship to the goals that you have? And to what ends are you willing to sacrifice your well-being, your peace of mind, in order to obtain that goal? And a lot of times our contentment and our peace of mind get sacrificed along the way in service of to see our goals come to life. One thing I found is a great quote, and it's really kind of two people I really found this from. It was Jim Carrey and George Harrison. So Jim Carrey, the actor and comedian, George Harrison was the guitarist for the Beatles. And basically, both of them were saying the same thing. along the lines of, I wish everyone could become rich and famous, to realize that really what they want is not to become rich and famous. I wish everybody could become rich and famous, because then you realize that's really not what you wanted in the first place. And sometimes we have to go through this process where we think we know what we want. We think we know what's going to make us happy, right? And that's that if only game. If only I have this, I get this promotion, I'm at this level. If only I'm making this amount of money. If only I have, my significant other and I found my partner. If only we're able to have a child. If only we have a house in this area. And so we play this game with ourselves, this if only, as if we reach this certain stage, or we have this certain thing, or we get past this certain obstacle and then everything will be fine. That's the trap. That's the trap. And so what Santosha is inviting us to is, regardless of where we are in relationship to our goals, in relationship to our life's process and what we have and what stage of life that we're at, is to come back to a heart of gratitude and being content with where we are in that moment. Much easier said than done. And so one question to sit with is, how much time and energy do you spend navigating people, your time and money, to satisfy your likes and avoid your dislikes? The next niyama is called tapas. Tapas means self-discipline. Literally translated, tapas means heat. And so it's speaking to, like with purity, it's expanding on the idea of saucha, where it's a process of chemical change, right? So we have physical states of change. So like where you have water, which is frozen, becomes ice. But once we heat it, then there becomes a chemical change where it changes, it changes altogether. And so tapas is inviting us to burn away the aspects of us that undermine, distract, and enable us to be who we're not. And that can sometimes be more difficult to see, because this is a lot of times happening on a subtler level. At times we have intense struggle, like hopelessness, desperation, when we experience loss, maybe debilitating sickness, where we have an unexpected, really challenging event, trauma, and then we may not necessarily understand or appreciate the change that's being precipitated within us. So a lot of times there's resistance. And so the tapas is redirecting us back. Once we feel resistance, once we feel that something is happening for us, because life is always happening for us, not to us, then we come back to our true nature. We come back to our practices. We come back and find inspiration, right? And so for me, tapas, that is the essence of tapas. When I'm void of inspiration is when I'm bound to make mistakes. When I'm void of inspiration is where I get tired, I get unmotivated, I start to complain, I get in more relational conflicts, I'm absent of gratitude. So what you have to find for yourself, what is the main thing that you need in order to continue on in the person that you want to be? For me, one of those central themes is inspiration. So when I'm void of inspiration, it is my tapas, it's my discipline to come back, stop what I'm doing, and find that inspiration again. And then go back to acting and being in the world. Another important point is, with discipline, this can oftentimes, in our culture that has a very goal-oriented, sort of rigid point of view, especially in terms of our work and our outputs, our scheduling and our production, it sort of has like a rigid feel to it. And that's why I think a lot of times people's greatest stresses tend to be work and the demands that our work places upon us. And so one thing that I've found is really helpful is to have a sense of what I call flexible discipline. And a friend of mine, her name is Kim, studied with us at Peachtree Yoga in Sandy Springs. And I remember her mentioning there was a certain yogi philosophy that she had listened to, and it was saying, if you're having to force your sadhana is your spiritual practice. If you're having to force it, then it's not sadhana, right? Because as we'll come to a little bit later, we want to be governed by a principle of effortless and ease. We want to be in the flow of life. We want to be in harmony with nature. If we're forcing and we're struggling and we're fighting against the current of life, that's not tapas, right? That's ultimately going to cause conflict. That's ultimately going to cause sickness. So I find that flexible discipline, where I have my practices and I commit to them, but if I really feel in that moment that's not what I need, then that's not what I need. So having enough awareness and then giving yourself enough grace to be able to make some choices based on what it is that you need in the moments as you're going through them, especially when we're going through purification, right? When we go through purifying processes, it can, physiologically all the way through spiritually, can really be difficult, and it can really throw off our sense of self. It can really throw off our physiology. It can really throw our emotions for a loop, back and forth, from anger, sadness, and everything in between. It can really mess with our sense of self and our sense of self and our mentation. And because a lot of times as we're going through our lives, and especially as we have a spiritual practice, our relationship and understanding of the world and reality can shift. And when that does, your sense of self can really be vulnerable. And so that's quite a large hazard, for someone going through this that doesn't have the proper teaching and support. And so that's why the aspect of flexible discipline, to be able to give yourself what you need in that moment and having a set of tools to be able to accompany and facilitate that, is critically important. So some questions to sit with in regards to tapas is, to what aspects of your life do you find it easy to be disciplined? What aspects of your life do you find it difficulty in being disciplined? And then, is your tapas too rigid, or is it too malleable? Because I spoke to being too rigid, but if it's too flexible and there's not enough commitment, then that also is a problem on the opposite end of the spectrum. Another concept to sit with. All right, so the next niyama is called svadhyaya. Svadhyaya. Svadhyaya translates to self-study. It literally means one's own lesson. Svadhyaya is the practice of bringing awareness to the layers of our true nature. So some of the layers that basically surround and encompass what we are at the very core are belief systems, the country that we live in or that we're born to, our culture, gender identification, ancestors, our biological family, our peers, personal experiences, spiritual practices, and really all aspects of our life, right, that constitute our experience and that influence how we interact, perceive, and investigate our worlds. So there's a story that she gives in the book about how some kids wanted to give their dad a really good present for Christmas, and so they saved up, bought a diamond ring. But what they did was, a ring, a piece of jewelry, is very small, so it doesn't take a very large box. But what they did to make it more fun was they put the box with the ring in it inside 7 other gradually larger boxes. So the dad, when he goes to open it on Christmas, is, open the first box, second box, and right, you can see he kind of gets, a little bored, and you're like, all right, where's this going? And so then the level of expectation, right, as you get down to the last box, you're just assuming it's going to be another box. So it does this exercise, right, where I find expectations for us as humans is such an obstacle, right? We have this vision of what we want the experience to be, and then that creates suffering when the reality of it doesn't match. So by the time this dad got to the last box with the ring in it, his expectations are absolutely zero, and then he was just blown away. And so these boxes are like metaphors to the layers of our being, right? It's all these layers of stuff, right? It's basically, it's all of our stuff. And what do I mean by that? It's what we believe It's all of these concepts we adhere to. It's our religious teaching. It's cultures, genders, ancestors. It's our family and all of the beliefs and all the dynamics that we take on and then replicate unknowingly before we heal it and bring awareness to it, that we carry on with us. These are the areas that we want to investigate. And so what's the easiest way to do this? These life lessons come to us, right? And so whether it's hardship, victory, defeat, they're all bringing awareness to these veils that hide our divine nature. And so, you only have to go as far as what pisses you off, what makes you feel inferior, what makes you feel vulnerable or inadequate, what makes you feel slighted, undervalued, unheard, taken advantage of. Anything that triggers a strong emotion is basically an example is Svadhyaya. That is something to investigate and look into, self-study. Because whenever we make a comment about the world, we're actually speaking more of our own selves than about the world. It's merely our own projection of ourselves that's displayed against the landscape of the universe and reflected back to us. People in the world reflect back to us what we're seeing, not necessarily what is there. Because in the world, everything is there. But what we see is just our small focal point of view of that. And so what we're receiving back from our environment, from the people in it, right, from the institutions and everything, is a reflection of us. It's much more a reflection of us than the world, because the world is everything. And we only see very, very limited viewpoints of that, especially at given times. So, some questions to think about for Svadhyaya is, what are some of the current lessons and themes that have come up for you? And then how are these challenges, but I invite you to look at it as an opportunity, are inviting you to change your perspective, your perception, and the potential action that you could take towards a more coherent and loving state of being. So what lessons are coming up? And then what are these lessons presenting in terms of a invitation to change your perspective, your perception, and the action that you may take? And the last of the yamas and niyamas, this is the 10th, it's the final niyama, is called Ishvara Pranidhana. Ishvara Pranidhana. Ishvara Pranidhana translates to the jewel of surrender. The jewel of surrender. There's an anecdote in the book that talks about the symbolism and sort of this I wouldn't say dichotomous nature, but some would refer to it as that. There's basically the wolf and the lamb within every human being. And so the wolf is the symbol of our animal nature, and the lamb is the symbol of our divine nature. And we see the same thing, right? If you go to a Christian church on a Sunday, within the first 30 minutes they're playing music, you're bound to hear something along the lines of, glory of the Lamb, something glorifying the Lamb. And I think it's really coloring the same symbolism, the same point, right? Where it's true, we do have physical bodies and they have needs that are no different than our mammalian counterparts on the animal kingdom. But we also have this other aspect to us that is the Lamb, and that's the divine nature. And so and this I think came from the American Indian heritage, but he was saying, feed the lamb. So we recognize the wolf, we respect the wolf, but we more feed the lamb than we do the wolf. I like, there was this point in the book that I just have to read. We're so often preoccupied with feeling cheated or being a victim when life doesn't go our way that we often miss the opportunity right in front of us. Why? Because when we don't surrender, we're efforting, we're triggered, we're in conflict, we're insisting that things should be other than the way that they are. That creates suffering. So this is a tricky tricky niyama because it's subtle. Because, okay, I could take this in one way and say, well, I'm just going to surrender to everything. But that's not necessarily the right way to go about it. Because if I just surrender to everything, then I'm just taking a passive role in life, right? And I'm not acting and being in the world. I'm not setting boundaries. I'm not communicating, right? So it's not this global passivity, but it's, again, what's your relationship to it? To what are you surrendering to? And so that's what I think the teaching of Ishvara Pranidhana is about, is surrendering to the divine nature. And so whether or not you give this a name, right? Allah, God, Brahma, what have you, we surrender to the divine force because it acts with a greater intelligence than we have access to. Sometimes we are able to observe certain phenomena, but we don't have a consistent, coherent viewpoint of the entire world as it is. That's what the process in the practice of yoga is helping us to cultivate. So we surrender to that which we can't control. We surrender to the nature of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Once we do that, the amount of possible outcomes and the amount of solution and the way in which we can respond to the challenges and the circumstances in front of us is magnified tremendously. Right? If we're in that struggle and we have not surrendered to the circumstance that we find ourselves stuck in, then this is where that classic example where it's like, well, I have one of two choices, right? It's I either fight or I run away. But there's always more choices than that. It's the process of surrendering to the nature of that circumstance first, surrendering to the fact that this is where I am and this is how I feel. And once we actually give in to that, our mental apparatus comes back. We actually realize we have much more choice, and we start firing off with creativity about the way that in which we can interact with these circumstances. And I felt this in real time for myself, and it's taken me over 3 decades to actually realize how much I was in my limbic brain. The limbic brain is at the posterior backside of the brain, and this is where the fight or flight response, fight, flight, or freeze response actually happens neurologically. And so it actually took about, let's say that's almost 9-10 years of yoga practice and saucha purification practice before I realized even some circumstances that weren't actually that threatening, I still hadn't surrendered enough into to really have a full plethora of options to really sit with and not really seeing it for what it is. There's still a part of me that's holding and not willing to surrender. And so that is really the gold in this Ishvara Pranidhana practice, is surrendering to the circumstance, surrendering to the divine nature, and that the circumstance, the way it is perfect. It's just that we don't understand and see the big picture. And this is how, we find and accept our calling and our highest purpose. We no longer chase and grapple with our desires. Instead, we release and let go and see what we're called into. This is how we also get into a flow state, right? Where things just become effortless, right? And we receive the things that we need. We find the people that we love. We create the community that we want to be a part of. This is how we do it, is through Ishvara Pranidhana. And I it's one of my favorite parts of every yoga class, whether I take it or teach it. There's a pose called Shavasana, and it's called corpse pose. And basically, we're lying on the mat for 7 to 10 minutes in basically total silence, little music, and then it tapers off. And so this is basically the Ishvara Pranidhana practice. I'm just laying down, eyes closed, and totally allowing my body to soften and surrendering into the state of being. And that alone in and of itself is super refreshing. But after an entire class where you're moving and rebalancing and bringing the body into alignment, it's a great way to practice this tenet of Ishvara Pranidhana. So that encompasses the first 2 limbs of yoga. I know that was a lot, but the first 2 limbs of yoga, yama and niyama. So those are our 10 ethical tenets and encourage us to reflect in relationship with others and to relationship with ourselves. Now, the third limb of asana, or the third limb of yoga, rather, is called asana. So this is the physical practice that most people recognize and make synonymous with yoga. Asana is a very intelligent practice because it is, again, written in Sanskrit, and every single pose basically describes in Sanskrit the way that the body is oriented to the ground, and then what part of the body is brought awareness to and moving. So it's really interesting in that way. And when I was working at Jacob's Ladder, we had these long, IEPs, basically individual education programs, and a big portion of that was on these soft mats, where we're doing a lot of work with the body. And because there is quite an inextricable link between the neural functioning of the brain and the physical body. And so a lot of times working with the physical body in a very patterned, consistent way helps the brain to then orient and link, and to be able to make those neural synapses connect to where there's more coherence through both the brain and the body. And there were certain exercises as I was going through my yoga teacher training that I realized we were actually doing on the mats with the children. The funny thing is we just had a different name for it. And a lot of times when we're doing the mat work, it comes from more the physical therapy, kinesiology background. And so you'd have something like asymmetrical tonic neck. But it's the exact same thing that we would do within a yoga class, but we just may call it, a slightly different term. But it's really doing the exact same thing. So build into the asana practice, which of course is known for stretching, strengthening, balancing. There's a deeper intelligence because a big part of the work that we were doing at Jacob's Ladder with the children is integrating early reflexes, right? And so that is a major foundation for brain development and higher learning. And so that is built into the practice of asana. It's built into the poses and the sequences of movements that we do in and out of poses to continue to work in strengthening the reflexes and the relationship of the brain and how it corresponds to the movements of the body. A big part of it is optimizing the relationship of all of the tissues, so muscle, tendon, and ligament relative to the skeleton, which is a critically important function. Most people's soft tissue injuries and joint issues are usually an issue with sometimes cartilage, which there's things in asana that we can do where we can create space in the joints, and then that allows the cartilage to heal a bit faster. But most issues resolve around ligaments and tendons. And then a lot of times we have more gross issues with misalignments in muscles. And this is what physical therapy and chiropractic, especially with the alignment piece, this is what their entire field is working on, right? What is the relationship between the tissues to the skeleton? And so I found because I did chiropractic before and after being a yoga teacher, and after doing so many hours, so many hundreds of hours of asana practice, I can almost go into the chiropractor and say, this is how my body's misaligned, or this is an area that I feel is off. Here's what's going on. Here's the muscles that are, tight, or, and basically tell them where my body's misaligned. And then I almost know at this point, most of the ways, the tools they're going to use to adjust me, which is pretty fascinating. So there is so much wisdom in how the asanas are packaged together in terms of these poses and movements. And it's not only about strengthening, stretching, and balancing, but it is like the Yoga Sutras are saying, it's this union. It's bringing together the different aspects of our being and helping everything be in a more harmonious state and a more communicative state. In this example, between the brain and the body. And it's critically important because of the focus on the spine. And that really is what separates yoga from a lot of these other physical practices, like like lifting weights and Pilates, etc. Is there is a focus on the health of the spine, because we realize in yoga that our bodies are made to move, and the spine is the most central piece that we have to keep healthy, right? Inside the spine is the spinal cord, which carries all of the information of signals that the brain sends to the body to then be able to create, kinetic movement and somatic movement. So keeping the spine healthy is one of the most important aspects about wellness and long-term well-being that there is. And so that's why I love asana. It's such a big part of my life. And I have to share this one quote from one of my yoga teachers. His name's Graham. So while asanas are critically important and great, he said, you can do 60,000 down dogs, but it won't get you there. Which I thought was a funny quote. And what he's speaking to is asana is critically important, and it's great for integration and physical health. If that's all that you have as a practice, then it's ultimately not going to get you to the aim of yoga, right? Because it requires a more process of going within, past the physical body itself. The fourth limb of yoga is called pranayama. Pranayama. Pranayama translates to breath control. And so that's where the term yama comes in. Yama means control. Prana, for anyone who's unfamiliar, is basically the Sanskrit term for life force energy, or chi. And so there's two essentially interpretations or practices of pranayama, or I guess I should say philosophical interpretations. There's pranayama, which we could call breath control, or there's prana ayama. In ayama, when you have the A, it makes whatever you're saying negative. So it's not breath control, but expansion of awareness, expansion of prana by way of the breath. That's the interpretation that I'm speaking to more in this instance for the fourth limb of yoga. Expansion of life force energy utilized through the breath. Pranayama is critically important because I have found through doing energy work for a number of years, the breath is the most accessible and oftentimes the most powerful way to move energy in and through the body. And one thing I've noticed in even chiropractic adjustments, they'll tell me to breathe in a certain area. It's the same thing that I say in yoga classes, right? Especially yin yoga classes where we're working more the joints and the connective tissue, is we're stretching an area, bring awareness to it, and then also breathe in that area. And when we do that, the propensity for change is magnified immensely for that area of the body. There's actually traditions that give the same name for breath as they do for spirit, which I also find interesting. It's this great reverence for the breath and the nature of the subtle energy and basically the creative life force, right? Which is synonymous with, with essentially, with God and with Brahma. And there's the last thing I'll say about pranayama without going too deep into it is the ratios of the inhale and the exhale. And that is kind of the most fundamental piece of pranayama and what makes it a practice. It's not just breathing deeply, but the ratios in which you breathe in the inhale relative to the exhale and the exhale to the inhale can really change the constitution, the energetic constitution of your body. If you breathe in longer than you breathe out, your body's metabolism will speed up. Your heart rate can speed up. Your blood pressure can speed up. Your metabolism in a small way can speed up. Conversely, if you are exhaling more than you inhale, then your body is going to slow down. Heart rate's going to slow. Blood pressure is going to slow. Mentation's going to slow. Nervous system's going to slow. Parasympathetic nervous system response is going to increase, right? So your body is going to slow down and soften. So based upon the needs that you have, the way in which you would utilize the pranayama can dramatically shift the way that your energy expresses itself, which is a tremendous tool to have. Pranayama. The fifth limb of yoga is called pratyahara. Pratyahara. Pratyahara is a withdrawal of the senses. Withdrawal of the senses. So as I was speaking to earlier on one of the yamas and niyamas about this overstimulation that we find in our society, I think there is quite a lack of this limb of yoga, and there's very seldom a practice for pratyahara that I see outside of the yogic tradition. So there are, you could say, there's an aspect of pratyahara in prayer, right, where the eyes are closed, and there's bringing awareness inward, but pratyahara is typically practiced in a waking state where the awareness of consciousness is preserved. So where we're not going all the way to sleeping, right? Where we're not just closing the eyes and checking out, but we preserve awareness of what's happening within our body. So yoga nidra is a great practice for a pratyahara. There is a waking observation to the inner experience. And then with that, we cultivate an increasing ability to be able to move that point of awareness within the inner being. And then that brings us more aware when we have imbalances and disturbances within our body. The quieter that we get, and the more inward that we draw our awareness, the more attuned we're going to be to the imbalances and the disturbances within the subtle aspects of our body, even if you want to go only as subtle as the nervous system. And then to be able, and this is what I find with Reiki as well, because within Reiki is a pratyahara. The person that's coming on the table is closing their eyes and going within. And so for the people that go to sleep within a certain amount of time, there's a little bit less benefit because there's not an awareness preserved, right? Because when you're asleep, you shift states of consciousness, right? And so there's no longer an awareness so much of the physical body because your awareness has gone to a different realm in the sleep state. But while staying awake, there is a very unique opportunity to observe yourself in a very settled state, but move that point of awareness through the body, through your energetic field as needed. And it's a really great practice to then allow the practice of purification to show you what's coming up to be looked at, what needs to be healed. It's also interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, we're a culture that really seeks stimulation. We really kind of seek the opposite, and it's almost aggrandized at this point with the use of phones and, of course, social media and all that stuff. But an interesting fact that I found in another podcast, I can't remember his name now, but he's a neuroscientist from California, found that 80% of college students are taking prescription medications that are used for ADD and ADHD. And these are basically stimulants. I mean, some of them are even like amphetamine salts. 80% of college students, and even adults in the workplace, and especially when it comes to certain workplaces, like banking and finance, where it's heavy amounts of analysis for extended periods of time, sometimes consulting, are also using these stimulants in the workplace. And so with now this culture of medications, and especially a lot of them being stimulants, and now we have basically unlimited access to information. We could sit on YouTube the entire rest of our life for every single moment, not going to sleep, and watch an endless amount of videos, or read an endless amount of articles. Whatever your pick is, we can completely saturate ourselves over multiple lifetimes with the amount of information that we have available right at our fingertips. And so it's quite a temptation. And I find that the practice that is the answer to this is pratyahara. It is to go within, and it is to withdraw the senses from information, to withdraw the senses away from stimulation, and bring our awareness deeply back within inside ourselves to find where we're off balance, where we're off centered, where we need to bring our attention and love. The sixth limb of yoga is called dharana. Dharana means a single pointed awareness, a steadiness of mind that has its focal point on one single thing. Dharana also means holding, but it's different from a grappling, clinging type of holding, right? It's not the clenching type of holding, but it's holding awareness, cultivating awareness at one single event, at one single phenomenon. One way that we use dharana in an asana, physical yoga practice, is you'll be in a balancing pose, let's say tree pose, and you're standing on one leg, and you find one thing in front of you that's not moving, and you just stare at that one thing. And by doing that, it triggers through your eyes and into your brain, and then encoding into your body to stay still and just be focused on that one thing in front of you that's not moving. And so in connection to that one thing that's still, it helps your body stay still. A lot of times you'll see the best of athletes and people at their craft have an aptitude for dharana, right? They have an ability to be able to keep a keen level of focus on their work or on their craft, right? So an example that comes to mind, I'll use basketball for example. You have a crowded arena, and there's a player that's shooting for a game-winning free throw. And you have all this noise around you, and you have people waving their arms behind the backboard, which is clear, right? Which really can kind of mess with your vision. And only thing that they see is the rim and the net in front of them. And to shoot that shot as if nothing else in the world is going on except for that ball going into the net. That's an example of dharana. And we can bring dharana into our lives, into the physical world with eyes open. However, there is a certain way with yoga that we benefit even greater when we're using dharana with breath and in the yoga tradition with mantra. These are the primary tools for traditional dharana practice. And this is basically the root of meditation. It starts with dharana. It's kind of funny as I'm realizing a true meditation practice, a comprehensive meditation practice actually rides the limbs up. Where we start with, you would typically start with an asana practice and get the kinks out of your body. The asana practice also helps prepare your body for meditation because sitting for long periods of time is not great for physiology. But when we're open and flexible, it makes that process easier. Then comes pranayama, right? So usually it's nadi shodhana, the alternate breathing. And then with the pranayama, your eyes are closed, and within that period of pranayama, you are exercising a pratyahara, you're going within. And then at the end of the pranayama, you're continuing to draw the awareness inward, which is the pratyahara. And then if it doesn't arrive on its own, and this is a meditation practice called anubhava, which is very similar to transcendental meditation, you would bring in the mantra. And so the mind is like a radar, and it needs something to anchor to. Our mind is always looking and scanning. That's its function. That's what it does. And so we don't try to silence the mind and fight the mind, but we just give it something to anchor to. And even in Buddhist traditions that don't use mantra, they'll actually anchor to the breath. And so they'll just have you bring awareness to the breath at the nostrils. And so in either case, on almost all meditation practices, there is a dharana where it gives your mind one single thing to focus on. And it's so simple, and it gives the monkey mind enough of a banana to sit with to allow it to slowly get quieter. One example that I like of a dharana in the outside world, just to give it a one more concrete example. So there's the film The Dark Knight Rises, and the main protagonist, who's also Batman, is stuck in this pit this big concrete pit. It's almost like think of it like a large well. And so he has to climb out of the pit after his back is broken. So he heals, he gets stronger, and then each time he climbs up the pit with a rope tied around his body. It's basically like a safety net because the pit is several hundred feet high. So in this one jump that you have to make in order to get out of the pit, it's so far that you really have to make a leap of faith essentially. And so each time he jumps with the rope, he's not able to make it. Why? Because in one sense, there's something in the back of your mind that knows that you're okay. If you don't make it, you have the rope, you're not going to die. And so he's asking this sort of sage that's at the bottom of the pit with him, a doctor that's been helping him heal. And so he says, how do I make the jump? How do I get out of this? And he said, you have to jump without the rope. When you jump without the rope, you know that there's no safety net. And so the level of focus that then comes in when, your life is essentially on the line of what you're about to step into, becomes so magnified, that's sort of like a visceral way to understand dharana, where that is the only, like, it's as if that's the only thing in existence in that moment. All right, limb number 7, dhyana. Dhyana. Dhyana is a melting. It's an effortless dissolving of the object into consciousness. It also symbolizes an expansion of awareness in our experience beyond that of the physical body. And it is basically the second aspect of what happens in a meditation. And I found the easiest way to explain this in a little bit less abstract terms. There was two doctors, Andrew Newberg and Eugene Diakili, that performed research on two different types of spiritual practitioners. So they chose Tibetan meditators and Franciscan nuns. The nuns prayed, and obviously the Tibetans meditated. And so what they did was they invited each into a room one at a time, and then they used a SPECT machine, which is a single photon emission tomography machine, which basically all it does is it uses these photons to map the blood flow in a particular organ. So basically they wanted to map the blood flow of the brain as these people were meditating to see which parts of the brain are becoming more online and which are becoming more offline. So as they're measuring this, they basically tell the meditators and the people praying, once you feel that you're in a climax of your spiritual experience, or you're at the height of your meditation, tug on the twine, which I thought was a really great instruction to actually get good results for this. And what they found was actually fairly consistent results in very specific regions of the brain. There was a decrease in activity in the left hemisphere, where the language centers are, which would be Wernicke's and Broca's areas. So our access and interpretation of speech is turned down, right, because we're meditating, so that makes sense. And then this is what I also find even more interesting, a decrease in activity in the orientation association area in the parietal lobes in the left hemisphere. So this is the region of our brain that helps us identify basically the boundaries of our physical body and where our physical body is in space. So the decrease of activity in this area decreases our sense of where we end in space. So take that in reverse. Instead of the decrease in our boundaries, it's the expansion, right, of the emanation of ourselves. This is exactly what dhyana is. So it's interesting that these neuro researchers actually gave us a tangible example of exactly what's happening in dhyana, right? This is that expansion of our awareness and even our energy field, and our actual subtle body is increasing and taking up more space when we're in a meditative space. So that is the 7th limb. So this leads us into the 8th limb, which is samadhi. And I'm not going to say much on samadhi because it's ultimately beyond words. It is the experience of our true nature. It's pure unbounded consciousness. It's when we are beyond the reach of time and the orientation to space, and we're completely immersed in the experience exactly as it is. That's the goal of yoga. And not only to reach the state, but to maintain the state of being. And so a meditation practice that has these last three limbs, so dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, is what we would call a sanyama practice. And this sanyama practice is what helps us to build the union, the coherence, and the settling of the mind into silence, where it's all being cultivated at once. This is the essence of yoga. This is what yoga is helping us to do, and this is a time-tested, very intelligent, methodical way of being able to realize our true nature. And I find it very important to have a progressive and coherent practice, because there are ways that we can accelerate the process, right? So there's practices like certain ceremonies, like there's different types of dancing and drumming where we can release DMT. There's certain things that we can do chemically also, like ingesting chemicals like DMT or LSD or what have you, which can give us an accelerated process in a short amount of time. But it only does us good if we're able to integrate it and we're able to build coherence across that experience. So I find a progressive and coherent process for developing spiritually is extremely important, right? And it's how we can make small changes to our sense of self over time to where we literally don't become nuts, right? It's if we have too much of a change to our sense of self in too short a time, we can forget who we are and experience extreme disorientation. So a slow, progressive, and coherent process, to which I find yoga is a tremendous practice for doing so, is really how we can come about finding our own true nature and really find the calling that we are longing for. Those are the 8 limbs of yoga. Oh, and the last thing that I'll say, because I failed to mention earlier. So we tend to think of things as very linear, as a step-by-step process. But the reason it's called the limbs of yoga, the limbs don't grow one by one, right? Where one starts and finishes and then the next one starts. That finishes and the next one starts. They all grow simultaneously. So there's this non-linear nature to the growth of limbs in a tree, and also with these aspects within ourselves that are happening all at once. And there may be times where one is more present than the other, but these are all emanating and growing and changing and cultivating all at once. And so that is the essence of really what we are. We're non-linear and we're multidimensional. And this 8 limbs moving and changing at once is a multidimensional emanation, right? That's how it's configured, and that is us. And so the yoga practice is teaching us how we can come about doing that in a way that's manageable, in a way that is healthy and that builds union, coherence, and helps us settle our mind into silence so that we can act from the heart. That concludes episode 3 for Call of Your Soul. So now just taking a moment and settling with all that has been said and shared. And then again, if you're in a place to do so, I invite you to close your eyes. And for the settling and integration of this wisdom and information into your body and being. Taking a deep breath in. Hold. And out. Thank you all so much for listening, and wish everyone a beautiful and blessed day.